Hi, everybody. Brad Truax here again from Eastman's Woodlands and Wildlife Committee. And today we're going to talk about squirrels. Again, it's just about the fall season, so the squirrels are busy out there trying to cache some nuts for the winter. This squirrel, again, reminds us that acorns are really a key source of nutrition, not only for squirrels, but for many of our wildlife here at Eastman. And we will have a separate video on acorns and hard mast, and we hope that you'll take a look at that as well. Uh, Squirrels are moderate-sized rodents. They're obviously bigger than mice and rats, but they're smaller than porcupines and beavers. And we usually separate squirrels into two types, tree squirrels and ground squirrels. The tree squirrels are the gray squirrel, the red squirrel, the black squirrel, the masked squirrel, also known as the fox squirrel, and flying squirrel. And on the other hand, the ground squirrels are the prairie dog and the chipmunk. Obviously, we don't have prairie dogs here at Eastman, but we do have plenty of chipmunks. Squirrels are seen everywhere in the United States. And again, their populations are higher in forested areas that have lots of oak trees and beech trees, since their favorite foods are acorns and beech nuts. But they're also going to raid your bird feeders for the seed that you have. Gray squirrels are the most common squirrels. And once again, they're much more likely to be seen in forest areas that have lots of oak and beech trees. And in fact, acorns, hickory nuts, beech nuts, and walnuts comprise about three-quarters of their annual diet. They will also eat other things like berries and fruits and seeds and buds, flowers, and even cultivated grains. But again, they especially like your bird feeders and the seed that you put in your bird feeders. And gray squirrels typically have multiple caches of nuts so that they have food whenever it's not otherwise available. That's a little different than the red squirrel, which tends to have a single cache. And squirrels commonly cache nuts below leaf litter or inside hollow trees or even underground. And here's a fun fact: a gray squirrel can actually hide 25 nuts in half an hour and can later go back and find roughly 80% of those nuts that he buried. Gray squirrels have slender, long bodies, bushy tails, and prominent eyes, and their fur is gray or brownish gray with a white underside. And typically, their adult body is a little bit less than a foot, and their tail may be 7 to 10 inches long. And the adults typically weigh about 1 pound. They have very large incisors that they use for gnawing, and they also have cheek teeth that they use for grinding. So, particularly some of those nuts that they eat need to be ground up. And they also have very sharp claws for climbing, and their rear legs are longer than their forelegs, and their ankles can rotate 180 degrees. That allows them to climb down trees head first. And they can leap from branch to branch and tree to tree, but they also spend a lot of time on the ground. Gray squirrels are crepuscular, again, most active at dusk and dawn, and they tend to rest during the heat of the day. Sometimes they sploot. That means they lie flat out with their belly on a cool surface, and they're doing that to cool off in the heat. They don't hibernate, and they're active year round. Tail of the tail. Why the long bushy tail? Well, it probably has multiple functions. It helps keep rain, wind, and cold off the squirrel. It helps cool off when it's hot because they can actually pump more blood through the tail to dissipate heat in that fashion. And it's somewhat of a counterbalance when they're jumping about in trees. And it acts somewhat like a parachute when they're jumping between trees. And it may be also used in signaling. And last of all, it may prevent some predators from behind recognizing them as prey. So take a look at this squirrel. Again, squirrels often hold that tail up in this fashion when they're eating. And if you look here, if you're a predator and you're looking from behind, you may just see this bushy tail and not recognize that that's the body of a squirrel in front of you. So it might serve as camouflage. Well, gray squirrels use both leaf nests and cavity nests, and they use these for shelter and for rearing their young. The leaf nests are most commonly constructed in hardwood trees, and for cavity nests, they prefer live trees. Unfortunately, they may also nest in attics and exterior walls of houses, so they can be quite a nuisance. This is showing a leaf nest. Again, these are constructed by twigs, leaves, moss, and other material, and they're usually at least 20 feet off the ground, so they're up pretty high. They tend to be most often constructed in hardwood trees, and especially in the fork of the tree. So again, you can see one here. And obviously, they're considerably larger than most bird nests. So again, they're very sizable nests. The nests that they produce in tree cavities are also very important for them. And again, they usually prefer live trees for these cavity nests. And they may choose a cavity den that was first created by a woodpecker and then later abandoned by the woodpecker. And they reclaim it as squirrels for their family. Or there may be simply natural processes that hollowed out an old tree. This was a natural process that hollowed out this old tree. And actually, the tree cavity nests offer best protection from wind, rain, and snow. Squirrels breed twice a year. They have a very short gestation period. The litters arrive either in February or March, or once again in June and July. And the average litter size is between 1 and 4, but sometimes as many as 8 babies have been known. And the newborns, again, are pink, hairless, and blind. And the female alone cares for the newborns. And weaning is finished by about week 10. And they reach their full adult body mass by about 8 to 9 months. Squirrels can be very vocal. They have a variety of vocalizations, including a squeak that's similar to a mouse, a low-pitched noise, a chatter, and a raspy mer, mer, mer. Okay. Listen to those teeth chattering. Uh, Average lifespan of a squirrel is 5 to 10 years in the wild, but the juvenile squirrels often don't survive that first year. In fact, only 1 out of every 4 squirrel kids survives that first year. Their mortality rate is still around 55% the following year, and then drops off to 30% or less after that. So, why did the juveniles die? Well, first of all, the nest might fall from a tree. The mother might abandon them due to hypothermia or some other reason, or they might fall prey to a predator. So, what good are squirrels? Yeah, they can be pests, but they also have some benefits. First of all, they help disperse seeds that may ultimately grow into new trees. The nuts that they don't eat may serve as food sources for other wildlife, and they may eat some insects that we otherwise don't want around. And they're a key part of the food chain. They're a big part of the diet of some larger animals. We'll see some examples in a few minutes. And their abandoned tree cavity nests can then be used by other cavity dwelling wildlife. Farmer's Almanac says squirrels can predict what the winter is going to be like. Squirrels gathering nuts in a flurry will cause snow to gather in a hurry. A very bushy tail means the rough winter ahead. Squirrel nests higher in the trees suggest the colder, snowier winter. Those lower in trees suggest the milder winter. Well, again, the Farmer's Almanac is largely myth. But once again, we can probably learn a lot from wildlife. They're probably much better at predicting what's going to happen in the winter and the long term than we are. Uh, if you're out hiking, you may come across a cache of nuts. Many animals do cache foods in preparation for winter, and squirrels cache acorns and other hard mast. Once again, the gray squirrel usually has multiple caches, but the red squirrel usually has a single cache, which we'll show you an example of in a few minutes. And blue jays also tend to cache nuts like acorns. This is showing basically a cache, a pile of shells from nuts that have been cracked. And these are called middens, and these are the shells of acorns or other nuts. And when you see this in the woods, it's a pretty characteristic sign of squirrels. Squirrels do leave tracks. They have 4 toes on their front feet and 5 toes on their rear feet. Once again, when you see the tracks in the snow or the mud, the hind paw prints appear in front. So these are hind paws here. The front paws are behind. And that's because they travel in a bounding pattern. And note there's a triangular pattern to the front feet, their front paws, but a more arc-shaped pattern to the rear paws. And again, you may only see 4 toes on the rear paw instead of the 5 that are actually there. Once again, this is showing the rear paws out front, the front paws are behind. And the one thing I want you to see here is that the feet are roughly parallel. And this is an important distinction comparing these to tracks of, say, a rabbit. So again, here in the snow, if you look in the snow in wintertime here at Eastman, aside from dog tracks, the most frequent tracks that you're going to see are those made by hares and squirrels. And there's some superficial resemblance here. But this schematic shows a difference between the two. Over here, the squirrel tracks, again, show that both the front feet and the rear feet are roughly parallel. You compare that to the hare, and usually there's an offset between particularly between the front feet. So again, that's an important distinction in separating out hare tracks from squirrel tracks in the snow. So again, this is showing squirrel tracks in the snow. And here you see an interesting pattern. Again, usually there are 4 toes on the front feet. Remember, the front feet are always behind when they're walking, and 5 toes on the rear feet. And there's a typical pattern. We call it the 1-3-1 pattern. And that means because the 3 middle toes are roughly the same length, you have this pattern of 1-3-1. And again, this is just showing the same thing. So again, 4 toes on the front feet, 5 toes on the back feet. And again, this 1-3-1 pattern. 1, then you have 3 toes that are similar in size, and then another 1. And again, the palm pads here for the front feet are roughly triangular as opposed to the rear feet, which tend to have more of an arc shape to them. Squirrel scat is roughly about 3/8 of an inch long and maybe 1/8 of an inch in diameter. And they're various size shapes. Some have rounded or tapered edges. When they dry, they tend to change color. And squirrels often leave piles of several pellets and then leave feces in the same area over multiple times. So almost like a latrine. And most often the scat is brown, but there are shades of red and other colors, even including some tan and green. Okay, so that's the gray squirrel. On the other hand, the red squirrel is smaller than the gray squirrel, but larger than the chipmunk. And these are widely distributed throughout North America. They're highly territorial. They defend their territory very aggressively, and they're very vocal. So again, that's a characteristic cry of the red squirrel. And even though they eat nuts and berries and mushrooms and a bunch of other things, the key thing that they feed on are the seeds of conifer cones. And as a result, these red squirrels are often known as the pine squirrel. And the red squirrels are very fond of the pine seeds, and they often stack high piles of pine cones. And in fact, one red squirrel once stashed 50 pounds of pine cones under the hood of a car. So again, here you have a red squirrel, and look what he's eating. He's eating the seeds from inside this cone. We mentioned middens. Middens basically are piles of nuts or the remnants of nuts. So again, unlike the gray squirrels, which tend to cache nuts in multiple sites, red squirrels typically have just one central cache. And again, the fallen scales from those seed cones collect in piles, and these are called middens, and these can be up to 12 meters across. Black squirrels are a variant of the eastern gray squirrel, and they're most often seen in the Great Lakes Basin, especially in Michigan. And most squirrels, in fact, in southern Ontario, Canada, are black squirrels. Occasionally, there are black squirrels that are also a variant of the fox squirrel, and most of those are just seen in the southern states. Only about 1% of all squirrels overall are black squirrels, but it depends on location. There was one study that was done that showed 66% of the squirrels in Ontario are black squirrels, 56% in Michigan, and about 15% in other Great Lakes states. When we lived on the Niagara River, the squirrels on the Canadian side were black squirrels, and those on the US side were gray squirrels. And every once in a while, a black squirrel would cross the river on the power lines into the United States. So is the black squirrel actually a genetic advantage? Well, some have speculated that the black color allows them to be camouflaged better in coniferous forests, whereas gray squirrels are better camouflaged in deciduous forests. But probably the biggest genetic advantage probably has to do with cold tolerance. The black squirrels, because of their coat, probably have a higher cold tolerance. And this, so heat retention probably explains why the black squirrels are actually more frequent in Canada and in the Great Lakes Basin. If you've ever golfed in South Carolina, you've probably seen these squirrels that actually look somewhat like raccoons. And these are called masked squirrels, or also known as fox squirrels or raccoon-faced squirrels. And they may be seen in the eastern U.S. and even in the Great Lakes and Canadian regions, but they're much more common in the southern states. So particularly in the Carolinas, Georgia, Alabama, and Florida. And the masked squirrel, again, is also known as the fox squirrel. And they're actually the largest of the tree squirrels here in North America, and much more frequent again in the southern states. And they also like forests that have an open understory, but with lots of trees that produce nuts, such as oak, pine, and hickory. And much like the gray squirrel, these are scatter hoarders, means that they cache their nuts in multiple locations. And again, that's different from the pattern that we see with the red squirrel. And the long bushy tail of the fox squirrel can be used either as a blanket or even as a parachute-like apparatus. And they can race from tree to tree, jumping over 15 feet, and they can free fall over 20 feet to escape predators. And their claws are razor sharp. Flying squirrels, no, they don't really fly. If you remember, the only flying mammal is actually the bat. Rather, the flying squirrels actually glide through the airs. And they have this special membrane that goes between their front feet and their back feet. It allows them to glide through the air between trees. In fact, they can glide more than 150 feet in a single glide. And actually, skydivers and base jumpers have developed a suit that actually mimics this anatomy of the flying squirrel. There are two types of flying squirrels, the northern one and the southern one. The northern one being somewhat larger. And the southern flying squirrels are seen throughout the eastern United States, all the way from Maine down to Florida, and west as far as Texas, and south, or as far as Minnesota, south as far as Texas. But the northern flying squirrel has a patchier distribution. They're found primarily in the northeast and along the west coast into Idaho and Montana. Flying squirrels tend to live in deciduous and coniferous forests and woodlands, and they do make their home in snags, woodpecker holes, nest boxes, or abandoned nests of birds and other squirrels. Sometimes they'll nest together in the winter in order to keep warm. Like other squirrels, flying squirrels like to eat nuts, but they may eat some other things: seeds, fungi, fruit, and insects. And in fact, they're probably the most carnivorous of the squirrels because sometimes they supplement their diet with eggs, small birds, particularly newborn birds, and they will sometimes feast on carrion that they find. Okay, overall, squirrels do have a number of predators. They really are an integral part of the food chain. They're vulnerable to multiple predators like the fox, coyotes, bobcats and lynx, weasels, owls and hawks, snakes, and they're also prone to some diseases like typhus, plague, and tularemia, which they can spread, and those diseases can actually kill the squirrels themselves. And they're also vulnerable to multiple parasites and viruses. And again, facts of life: nature is not always kind to the squirrel. The squirrel, again, is an integral part of the food chain. And here, this red fox has caught this unfortunate gray squirrel. So there are a number of ground squirrels. Again, those are prairie dogs and chipmunks. And of course, we don't have any prairie dogs here at Eastman, but we certainly have lots of chipmunks. And again, chipmunks are clearly members of the squirrel family. They're found mostly here in North America, and they're the smallest of the squirrel family. They're usually only about 8 inches or so in length, and at most 12 inches when you include the tail. And they only weigh 1 to 5 ounces. And I remember a gray squirrel typically weighs about a pound. So again, a chipmunk is much smaller, and they have reddish brown fur with white underbellies, but they have these characteristic black stripes, usually 5 of them, separated by cream colored stripes. And these go all the way down their back to their tail, and their tail is darker. And they also, like the other rodents, have 4 toes on the front feet, 5 toes on the rear feet. And chipmunks, again, are often called ground squirrels. And they're, even though they're very good climbers, they spend most of their time on the ground. And the chipmunks construct extensive burrows, which can be more than 30 feet long and 3 feet deep. And they often have several well-concealed entrances. They're very protective of their burrows, and they tend to lead solitary lives. And they mostly cache their food in larder burrows, but they also do some scatter hoarding. It's kind of like an insurance policy. So if something happens to their burrow, they can go find some nuts in these other areas that they've hoarded them. The chipmunks really don't hibernate, but they usually go into a state of torpor in the winter where they sleep most of the time and do lower their body temperature and their metabolic rate somewhat. And they'll remain in that fashion in their nest till spring. Their sleeping quarters are usually kept clear of shells, and their feces and other waste are stored in refuge tunnels. And this is showing the chipmunk burrow. These are very elaborate structures ranging from 10 to 30 feet, and there are usually multiple entrances, some of which are very well camouflaged. And they tend to cache their food in larders. And there's a chamber for sleeping, which is usually up here. This is the nest area. And there's a separate chamber for disposing of waste down here. So what do chipmunks eat? Well, they mainly forage on the ground, but occasionally they'll climb trees for nuts. Their diet consists mainly of seeds, nuts, fruits, berries, and buds. But they'll also eat grasses, shoots, fungi, insects, small frogs, worms, or even baby snakes, but they'll also occasionally eat bird eggs and rarely the newly hatched baby birds. So they can be considered carnivores as well as herbivores. And once again, they'll raid your bird feeders, and they love sunflower seeds. They mostly cache their foods in the larder in their burrows, but as I mentioned, as kind of an insurance policy, they'll also cache some of their food at other sites so that if something happens to their burrow, they have some food that's been cached elsewhere. The chipmunks are usually quite solitary, except when they're mating. And they, like the squirrels, mate twice a year, once in the spring and again in late summer or early fall. And they use specialized vocalizations in their mating rituals. And after mating, the female chipmunks raise the young alone. And once again, the young are like squirrel young. They're usually pink, bald, and hairless and blind. And the newborns stay in the burrow for about 6 weeks, and they become independent about 2 weeks after they emerge from the burrow. Predators of the chipmunks. Chipmunks have lots of predators. In fact, every day they're faced with this trade-off: eat and risk being eaten. Remember, chipmunks are an important source of bird for a number of predators: hawks, owls, snakes, weasels, fox, bobcats, fishers, raccoons, big rats, and coyotes, and even house cats. My daughter once had a house cat that almost every day used to bring back a dead chipmunk. So how do chipmunks reduce their risk of predation? Well, first of all, those complex burrow systems that we described have multiple entrances and exits, so that makes it easy for them to escape if a weasel or somebody else tried to follow them into their burrow. And they also have specialized alarm calls. Chipmunks have these iconic cheek pouches. And again, they use these cheek pouches to carry food back to their burrows, to either eat the food when they get to the burrow, or simply store the nuts and other substances in the burrow. But they're part of the food chain as prey for multiple mammals, but they also are predators themselves, particularly with regard to bird eggs and nestlings. Chipmunks are very vocal. They get their name from going chip, 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 but they also have several different vocalizations. Though they're solitary, they often use these vocalizations to communicate with potential mates, to signal their territory, or to signal alarms. They often make a high-pitched trill when they're running. And if they sense a predator on the ground, they warn others with chips, sharp, high-pitched calls. And if they sense that predator in the air, such as a hawk or an owl, they warn others with something called chucks. These are lower-pitched sounds, like a stick rapping on a hollow wooden block. And I couldn't get these to quite play in this presentation, but if you want to hear those sounds, you can go to this YouTube site to hear them. So again, squirrels at Eastman, the type of squirrels you're going to most likely see at Eastman are the gray squirrel and chipmunks. Since we're now entering autumn, you're going to see them very actively collecting and caching nuts and seeds. And you would think with all the pine cones that we have this year, we'd be seeing a lot more red squirrels. Remember, the favorite food of red squirrels are the seeds of various cones. But the red squirrels seem to be quite rare here. And we've never seen a flying squirrel here, but let us know if you have. So what do you think they're telling us now about the upcoming winter? So that's squirrels and chipmunks. We hope that you've enjoyed this. And once again, join us in the future.